The morning I signed the papers on my wood shop, I sat in my truck for a long time before going inside. I just looked at the building, the one I'd spent 11 years saving for, the one I'd drawn on graph paper at the kitchen table while my wife was still alive, the one that now had my name on the deed and no mortgage attached to it. 4,200 square feet of Douglas fir framing, a concrete floor I'd poured myself, and every piece of equipment I'd ever wanted, arranged exactly the way I wanted it. I was 68 years old, recently retired from 30 years of Finnish carpentry, and for the first time in my adult life, I had nothing left to prove to anyone. I remember thinking, this is what peace feels like. I should have known it wouldn't last. My son had always been good at waiting, not patient, exactly more like a man who watches a door, waiting for it to open just a crack so he can get his foot in. He'd been watching me for years. I knew it. His wife had been watching longer. She had a way of looking at my property, the 4 acres, the shop, the farmhouse my grandfather built, the way some people look at a buffet, calculating, deciding what they want before they even pick up a plate. They lived 40 minutes away in a subdivision. Nice house, 2-car garage, HOA rules about the color of your mailbox. They'd done well enough. My son had a job in logistics, made decent money. His wife ran some kind of online resale business. They weren't struggling, but my land backed up to a new development corridor. And 3 years ago, a real estate agent had knocked on my door and offered me more money than I'd ever seen written on a single piece of paper. I'd said no without opening the door all the way. My son had found out. I don't know how. But within 2 weeks of that visit, the phone calls started. "Just checking in, Dad. How are you feeling, Dad? You know, at your age, all that property is a lot to manage." My daughter-in-law started sending articles, things she'd supposedly read that she thought I might find interesting. Articles about seniors simplifying their lives. Articles about the benefits of assisted living communities. Articles about families who'd waited too long to have certain conversations. I read every one of them. I understood exactly what they were saying. What I did next, I did quietly. I didn't tell anyone. I just made an appointment with an estate attorney named Patricia Holloway, whose office was in the next county over, and I laid out everything I owned and everything I suspected, and I asked her to help me build a wall they couldn't climb. That was 14 months before things went sideways. The health scare happened in October. Nothing dramatic. I got dizzy on a ladder while I was hanging new gutters on the farmhouse. I grabbed the rail in time, came down slow, sat in the grass for a while. My neighbor saw it happen and called my son before I'd even gotten back inside. I told my neighbor I was fine. I told my son the same thing when he called 20 minutes later. He didn't sound relieved. He sounded like a man who'd just been handed an opportunity. The doctor said it was dehydration and told me to drink more water. Blood pressure was normal. Heart was fine. I was given a clean bill of health on a Tuesday afternoon and was back in the shop by Thursday morning. But by Friday, my son and his wife were sitting in my kitchen with printed documents and very serious expressions. And the conversation I'd been expecting for 3 years had finally arrived. My daughter-in-law did most of the talking. She had a way of making concern sound like authority, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who'd rehearsed in the car on the way over. She said they'd been worried for a long time. She said the ladder incident was a sign. She said a man my age living alone on 4 acres operating heavy equipment in a shop by himself. It was dangerous. It was irresponsible. And frankly, it wasn't fair to them to have to worry about it. I let her talk. My son nodded along. He'd always been good at nodding. Then she slid the papers across the table. She called it a voluntary power of attorney. "Just a precaution," she said. "Just so that if something happened, They could make sure things were handled properly. She said a lot of families did this. She said it was the loving thing to do. I looked at the papers. I didn't touch them. I asked if they'd had these drafted before or after my doctor told me I was perfectly healthy. There was a pause. My son said the timing wasn't the point. I said I thought the timing was exactly the point. My daughter-in-law said they were also concerned about my mental clarity. She said the latter incident suggested I wasn't making good judgments. She said at my age, certain kinds of cognitive decline could happen gradually without the person even realizing it. She said they just wanted to make sure I was protected. I asked her if she'd spoken to my doctor. She said they hadn't yet, but they were planning to. I picked up my coffee cup. I took a slow sip. I set it back down. And then I told them both very calmly that I appreciated their concern, that I was not signing anything, and that they were welcome to stay for dinner or leave, but that the conversation about power of attorney was finished. My daughter-in-law looked at my son. My son looked at his hands. Then she looked back at me and said, in a voice that had gone cold around the edges, that they had already spoken to a lawyer. I said that was their right. She said they were prepared to pursue a guardianship petition if I wasn't willing to cooperate. I told her I understood. She said I should understand that a guardianship proceeding would involve a court evaluating my ability to manage my own affairs, and that the latter incident, combined with my refusal to discuss these matters, would not reflect well on me. I told her again that I understood. Then I stood up, walked to the back door, and held it open. They left. I stood at the kitchen window and watched their car back out of the driveway and disappear down the road. Then I called Patricia Holloway's office and left a message saying I needed an appointment as soon as possible, and that the situation we had discussed 14 months ago had moved to the next stage. What happened over the following 6 weeks was the most exhausting and clarifying period of my life. My son filed the guardianship petition. I had known he would. Patricia had explained the process to me in detail. It wasn't something you could do overnight, and it wasn't something you could do based on one dizzy spell and a daughter-in-law's opinion. The court appointed an independent evaluator. I met with her 3 times. She asked me questions about current events, about managing finances, about daily living. She toured my home and my shop. She reviewed my medical records with my permission. I answered everything directly and let her see everything she asked to see. The evaluator was a methodical woman who took careful notes and asked good questions. On her 3rd visit, she walked through my shop for nearly an hour, asking about each machine, asking me to explain what it did and how I maintained it, and what safety procedures I followed. I walked her through every piece of equipment. I showed her my maintenance logs, which I kept in a binder on a shelf by the door, dated entries going back 6 years. Every blade change, every belt replacement, every time I'd had a professional service the dust collection system. She didn't say much. She just wrote things down. I also had her read the letter from my physician, which described me as being in excellent health for my age, with no evidence of cognitive impairment, no history of falls, and no medical basis for concerns about my capacity to live independently and manage my own affairs. The petition went nowhere. The evaluator's report, which I later obtained a copy of, described me as a highly organized, mentally sharp individual with no observable deficits in judgment or capacity. The judge dismissed the case at the preliminary hearing. My son sat in that courtroom and watched it happen without a word. I thought it was over. I was wrong. 3 weeks after the dismissal, while I was in the shop running boards through the planer, my son came down the driveway unannounced. I heard his truck, looked up, kept the board moving through the machine. He came in and stood near the door until I finished the cut, and switched the machine off. Then I turned around and waited. He said he wanted to talk. Just talk. No lawyers, no papers. I told him to say what he had to say. He started with an apology. He said the petition had been a mistake, that his wife had pushed it further than he'd meant to go, that he'd been genuinely worried and hadn't handled it right. He looked tired. He looked like a man who'd been sleeping poorly and knew why. Some part of me, the part that had watched this boy grow up and had taught him to measure twice and cut once and stand behind his work, that part softened slightly. I listened. I didn't interrupt. Then he got to the part I'd been waiting for. He said that regardless of how things had gone in court, the fact remained that I was 68 years old, living alone, running a business because I'd started taking on custom orders from the shop, which brought in real money, and that the property had appreciated significantly and represented a substantial estate. He said he just wanted to make sure the family's interests were protected. The family's interests. I looked at him for a moment. I asked him to clarify whose interests he meant. He said, "Mine and the family's together." I asked what he was proposing. He said he thought it would make sense for me to put the property and the shop into a joint ownership arrangement. Him and me. So that if anything happened to me, there would be no delays, no probate, no complications. He said he'd already had someone draw up a simple agreement. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket and set it on my workbench. I didn't look at it. I said, "So the court didn't work, and now you're trying the direct approach." He said it wasn't like that. I said, "You drove 40 minutes to my shop to hand me a paper that puts your name on my property. Tell me what it's like." He didn't have an answer for that. I picked up the paper and handed it back to him. I told him I would not be signing anything, that my estate was already in order in a way that I was comfortable with, and that if he had questions about what would happen to the property after I died, he was welcome to ask my attorney. He left. This time, he didn't look back, but he wasn't done. Neither was his wife. The phone calls started again. Different in character now. Not concerned. Not warm. My daughter-in-law called twice in 1 week to tell me that she had spoken to the real estate developer, that the offer for my land was still open, that passing up that kind of money was foolish and selfish, and that I was depriving my grandchildren of a future. I had 2 grandchildren. I loved them both. I did not need to be told what I owed them by a woman who had spent the last 2 years trying to remove my right to make my own decisions. I told her I would handle my own finances. She told me I was being stubborn. I told her she was right about that. And I hung up. Then came the Tuesday that changed the shape of things permanently. I had gone to town for supplies, lumber order at the mill, a few things from the hardware store. I was gone maybe 3 hours. When I came back down my driveway, I noticed that the side door to my shop was open. I always lock that door. I'm particular about it, because the side door doesn't have a secondary latch, and if it's left open in wet weather, it warps. I'd told my son this more than once when he used to help me on projects. He knew. I parked and went to the door and pushed it open. My daughter-in-law was standing at my filing cabinet. The top drawer was open. She had papers in her hand. She didn't look particularly startled. She looked like someone who'd been caught. Doing something she decided in advance was justified. I asked her what she was doing in my shop. She said she was looking for the property deed. I stood there for a moment, just breathing. Then I asked her how she'd gotten in. She said my son still had a key from when he used to help me with projects. She said it as if this explained everything, as if a key given for one purpose extended to any purpose she decided it served. I asked her to put the papers down and leave. She put the papers on top of the cabinet, not back inside it. and walked past me without making eye contact. I heard her car start and pull away. I went to the cabinet. She'd been through the folder I kept with equipment manuals and warranty cards. She hadn't found what she was looking for, because what she was looking for had never been in my shop. That afternoon, I changed every lock on the property. I did it myself. 2 hours of work. Deadbolts on the shop doors, new keyed locks on the barn and the storage shed, a new lock on the farmhouse back door. I kept one key for myself. I sent no copies to anyone. Then I called my son and told him what had happened. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said his wife had only been trying to understand the situation. I told him his wife had broken into my property and gone through my personal documents, and that I was calling the county sheriff's office in the morning to report the incident. He said I was overreacting. I told him I would see him in court. He said, and I remember this precisely because I wrote it down that same evening. He said, "Dad, at some point you need to accept that you can't keep doing this alone. You're going to need us, and you're burning bridges." I told him I'd built every bridge on this property with my own hands, and I knew how to build them, so they lasted. Then I hung up. I did call the sheriff's office. A deputy came out, took a report, noted the evidence of entry, some marks on the door frame where the lock had been forced slightly, and the fact that my key was not missing, meaning they'd used a copy. He told me it would be documented. He told me that because my son had previously been given access to the property, the situation was legally ambiguous, but that the documentation of the report would be useful if there were future incidents. I thanked him and filed the report in Patricia Holloway's case file, along with everything else. Over the next month, my son and daughter-in-law tried 3 more times to contact me about the property. 2 calls, 1 letter delivered by certified mail. Patricia handled the response to the letter. The calls I didn't answer. I wasn't being cold out of spite. I was being careful out of experience. Every conversation they initiated had a purpose, and that purpose had never once been my well-being. I kept working. I had a commission, a dining table, and 8 chairs for a family in the next county. Custom design, white oak, book match top. Good work, the kind that takes full attention and gives it back to you as satisfaction. I was in the shop every morning by 7 o'clock. I'd eat lunch at the workbench. Some evenings I'd sit on the porch and watch the light change over the backfield and think about nothing in particular. The grandchildren called on their own once in a while. The older one, who was 14, liked to text me pictures of things he'd built at school. A birdhouse, a small shelf for his room. I texted back and told him what I would have done differently and why. He always wrote back with more questions. That meant something to me. Then, on a Thursday morning in late February, my son and his wife arrived with a moving truck. I saw it from the kitchen window. A rental truck, a large one, backed partway down the driveway toward the shop. My son was out of his truck talking to 2 men I didn't recognize who'd come out of the cab of the rental. His wife stood to one side with her arms crossed. I put my coffee down and went outside. I asked what was happening. My son said they were here to collect the equipment. I said, "Whose equipment?" He said, "The tools, the machines that under the circumstances, given his attempts to resolve the situation amicably, he had spoken to another attorney, and that attorney had advised him that as a potential heir, and given the documented concerns about my capacity, he had grounds to begin securing assets before they could be dissipated." I had never heard more words used to describe theft in my life. I asked him to say that again more plainly. His wife said, "Your son is protecting the estate. The equipment in that shop represents significant value, and given your refusal to cooperate with reasonable family arrangements, We are taking steps to ensure that value is preserved. I looked at her. I looked at my son. I looked at the two men by the truck who were looking at their feet. Then I went back inside. I heard my son say something to the men. I heard footsteps on gravel moving toward the shop. I went to the telephone on the kitchen wall, the landline I'd kept because cell service on my property was unreliable, and I called the sheriff's office. I told them I had people attempting to remove property from my premises without my consent, that there was a prior incident report on file, and that I needed a deputy out here as fast as possible. Then I walked back outside and stood in the driveway between the men and the shop door. My son told me to move. I said, "You will need to move me." He looked at me. I'm a bigger man than my son has ever been willing to remember. Decades of physical work will do that. He didn't move toward me. His wife said they had a legal right. I said, "Show me the court order." She said they didn't need a court order. I said, "Yes, you do. You need a court order signed by a judge to remove property from a private residence. You do not have one. What you have is a moving truck and 2 hired men and a plan that is about to go very badly for you." Her jaw tightened. I said, "The sheriff is on his way. You can wait here and explain this, or you can leave, but nobody is going in that shop." My son looked at his wife, a long look. Then he looked at me, and for just a moment I saw something cross his face that might have been shame or might have been calculation. With him, it was sometimes hard to tell the difference. He told the 2 men to wait by the truck. We stood there in my driveway for 18 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on my phone. Nobody spoke. His wife scrolled through her phone. My son stared at the ground. I stood with my hands in my coat pockets and watched the road. 2 deputies arrived in 1 vehicle. They came in calm and professional. I showed them the prior incident report. I explained what had just transpired. I told them no one had entered the shop. They spoke to my son separately for several minutes. I don't know everything that was said. What I do know is that when the deputies came back to me, they said there was no court order and no legal basis for removing property from my premises, and that if the other parties attempted to do so, they would be subject to arrest for theft. One of the hired men had already gotten back in the rental truck before the deputies finished talking. My son and his wife left without speaking to me again. The rental truck followed them out. I thanked the deputies. I went inside. I sat at the kitchen table for a while and let the quiet settle back in around me. That evening, I called Patricia Holloway and told her everything. She listened without interruption. When I finished, she said, "James, I think it's time." I agreed with her. What Patricia had prepared over the previous 14 months was not a simple document. It was a comprehensive revocable living trust that placed my home, my land, my shop, and all its contents under a trustee structure that I controlled completely during my lifetime. Upon my death or genuine incapacitation, as defined by written certification from 2 independent physicians, not the opinion of family members, the trust would pass to a designated successor trustee, who was Patricia herself, with clear instructions about distribution. My grandchildren were beneficiaries. My son was not excluded, but the conditions of his inheritance were specific and legally binding, and any attempt to contest the trust through litigation would result in his share being forfeited under a no-contest clause. There was also a letter. Patricia had drafted it with my input over 3 sessions. It was addressed to my son and filed with the trust documents. It laid out, in plain language, every incident, the original power of attorney attempt, the guardianship petition, the unauthorized entry into my shop, the attempted removal of property, and every phone call and letter in between. It was written without anger. It was factual, precise, and documented with dates, deputy report numbers, and attorney correspondence. It was the kind of letter that, once read by a judge, would leave very little to interpretation. The trust had been in place for 14 months by the time my son showed up with that moving truck. Everything that had happened since he filed the guardianship petition had simply added to the record. My property was protected, my rights were protected, and the documentation of their behavior was now thorough enough to be genuinely serious. Patricia sent formal notification to my son's attorney the following week. The notification informed him that my estate was held in trust, that all prior actions taken or threatened against my property were documented and on record, and that any further attempts to interfere with my assets or my autonomy would result in legal action, including but not limited to a civil claim for attempted undue influence and a referral to the county district attorney's office for review of the unauthorized entry incident. I received a call from my son's attorney 3 days later. He was professional and brief. He said his clients wished to discontinue all legal and personal communications with me for the foreseeable future. I said that was agreeable to me. I also filed a formal elder financial abuse complaint with the State Adult Protective Services Office. I want to be clear about why I did that. Not out of retaliation, not out of anger, but because Patricia explained to me that the pattern of behavior my son and daughter-in-law had demonstrated was one that agencies needed to have on record. Other people without attorneys, and without documentation, and without the stubbornness I'd been born with, had their lives dismantled by this exact sequence of events. The guardianship petition, the pressure to sign over assets, the unauthorized entry, the attempted removal of property. These weren't unique to my situation. They were a playbook, and if my documentation could help someone else down the line, then filing it cost me nothing. A PS opened a case and conducted their own review. I don't know all of what came from that. Some of it wasn't shared with me in detail. What I do know is that a caseworker visited my home in March, reviewed my circumstances, reviewed the incident reports, and noted in their records that I was a competent adult living independently with no signs of self-neglect or impaired judgment. I never heard from my son's attorney again. Spring came slowly that year, the way it does in the hill country, with cold mornings and warm afternoons, and mud on the paths between the farmhouse and the shop. I finished the white oak dining table in April. The family who commissioned it came to pick it up on a Saturday morning with a trailer, and the husband and I loaded it together, while his wife and daughters walked around the shop, looking at the pieces I had in progress. The older daughter, maybe 10 years old, ran her hand along a stack of figured maple I had drying on the rack near the window, and asked me what it would become. I told her I didn't know yet, that sometimes you had to wait for the wood to tell you. She thought about that and said, "How does it tell you?" I said, "You spend enough time with it, and it gets obvious." She seemed satisfied with that. After they left, I stood in the quiet of the shop, with the afternoon light coming through the west windows at a low angle, laying long shadows across the floor. The dust was still floating in the light the way it always does after work. The smell of fresh sawdust and finishing oil and dry wood filled the space completely. I had built this with my own savings, my own planning, my own hands. I had defended it, and it was still mine. I thought about my son. I thought about the 14-year-old who used to stand at this same workbench, not this shop, but the smaller one before it, watching me measure and mark and cut. I'd taught him to sharpen a chisel. I'd taught him to read a tape measure. I'd taught him that good work takes patience, and bad work will always show itself eventually. I don't know when he forgot those things, or whether he forgot them, or just decided they didn't apply to him. I don't know how much of what happened was him, and how much was his wife, and how much was just the slow accumulation of greed that happens when people start seeing aging parents as assets rather than people. Maybe those things don't come apart so cleanly. What I know is that he made choices, and choices have structure to them. The way wood has grain, you can work with it, or you can work against it, but you can't pretend it isn't there. My grandchildren still reach out on their own. The older one sent me a photo of a small cabinet he'd made in a woodshop elective at school. Mortise and tenon joints, fitted drawers, a simple finish. I called him instead of texting. We talked for 40 minutes about wood movement and drawer fit, and why you leave a gap at the bottom of a drawer front. He asked if he could come out and work in my shop over the summer. I said yes without thinking twice. My daughter-in-law, his mother, would need to decide whether to put her pride aside and drive him out here. That was her choice to make. I wasn't going to make it for her, and I wasn't going to hold my grandson hostage to her decision. I told him, "You figure out the ride. I'll have a project ready." He said, "I'll figure it out." I believed him. The real estate developer knocked on my door again in May. New representative this time, younger, with a different offer printed on different letterhead. The number was higher than before. I told him the same thing I'd told the last one. He asked if I'd be willing to talk. I said I was willing to talk. I just wasn't willing to sell. He left his card. I put it in the kitchen drawer where I keep things I don't need, but might someday want to look at. That evening, I sat on the porch after dinner with a cup of coffee and watched the field go from green to gold to gray as the sun dropped. The air smelled like warm grass and something blooming in the tree line that I'd never been able to identify. A whippoorwill called from somewhere in the wood edge 3 times, then stopped. 68 years old, and I had fought for my own life twice in the same year, and won both times. Not with rage. I want to be clear about that. I had never raised my voice during any of it. Never threatened. Never let emotion turn into error. I had simply known what was mine, documented what was happening, prepared for what was coming, and stood my ground when it arrived. Some people think the quiet ones are easier to push. That stillness looks like weakness from the outside. What they don't understand is that stillness is the thing you develop when you've learned the difference between what matters and what doesn't. When you've spent 40 years cutting to a line, you don't flinch when someone bumps the table. I had an estate in order, a shop full of good work, a grandson who wanted to learn what I knew, and a porch facing west where the light was doing something remarkable. I picked up my coffee and watched it until the dark came. I didn't need anything else. The following week I started a new piece, a writing desk, quarter sawn white oak, arts and crafts style, mortised legs, a leather inlay. I'd have a local saddle maker do. No commission, no deadline. Just something I wanted to build because I had the wood for it, and the time and the inclination. That's what freedom looks like when you're 68 years old, and you built it yourself from scratch. Not a number on a check, not someone else's plan for your days. Just you and the work, and the long mornings ahead.